my first question is, so like, how did you get here? Like,
how do I get to the school?
Yeah.
It was Kelly, the alumni from the school, who introduced me to Robert, who was your former head of school, and it was a really interesting meeting, our first meeting, because we talked about the 7 generations, what they referred to as the 7 generations program, and how they wanted to introduce reconciliation into the school. And through that, Robert and I started to work together, and we talked about how bringing Indigenous culture and understanding into the school was really important, but really important to focus on it locally and to look at the Anishinaabe culture, and really what they would need is somebody in the school who could teach it. So it was through that process that I became part of this, how I got here.
Oh, okay, awesome. Why do you feel Indigenous students would want to attend school here at RLC?
You know what, I think it's a small school. A lot of kids come from small communities, so it would be a small community as opposed to a school in the middle of a city. And I think kids who really need like to be close to nature, this is a really good school for them. There's a lot of outdoor things, and I actually think that the program itself, that the 7 generations is bringing to the school, is actually, as I said to Robert when we were doing this work, is ask yourself what would make an Indigenous student feel comfortable here. How can they see themselves within the school?
Right. So at RLC, at Rossel Lake College, Indigenous culture, history, and learning philosophies are integrated throughout our curriculum. What do you feel are key takeaways for high school students learning about our culture at this stage in their lives?
I guess when I think about it, I think because the school is a whole school, and you have such a big, not a big community, a school that comes together with many different cultures. And I think when you come together, you learn from each other. You learn what are the commonalities of your cultures, and what are your differences. And I think it's really important to celebrate the differences. And it'll take you places, and you'll learn things that you didn't think you would be interested in. I think that learning about our culture in Canada when they come here is really important. Mm-hmm. And I just, I guess I believe reconciliation in Canada will not happen unless people understand our shared history together, and what we all need to unlearn and relearn.
Awesome. So, what are some best practices when supporting Indigenous-focused education initiatives?
You know what? Before we go, I'm going to ask Corey if he would want to respond to that before me. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. I think Corey, you're on, eh?
Yeah, for sure. Hey, everybody. I'm glad to see so many people here. And Sadie's doing an amazing job. And I see her family support from back home, which is good to see. Her mother, and I believe that's your niece as well, potentially. Yeah. So some people from back home supporting, so amazing. Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, some of the best practices when looking at those Indigenous focused programs and models and initiatives, one of the biggest things that you have to do right off the hop that I find is, if you're an organization or an individual or anything of the sort, the first thing is to involve before you even come up. You might have an idea, but before you engage in the process of planning and implementation, you have to include the partner right away. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces. So no matter where you are across the board, you know, having that reciprocal relationship right off the beginning is key, to have those shared views and lenses in your planning process, because there will always be two different views that not necessarily can conflict against each other, but they are unique to their own self that add to the fabric of it, if that makes sense. So both the different views, from an Indigenous view to a non-Indigenous view, whether it be an organization or a mission statement or a goal, there's always different pieces that will be added to add to the success of it. So I think that's a big piece, is right off the hop, including that partner, and also giving space, having a space that having a space so your partner has a voice, and an equal voice, and equal importance on every level. So for advocacy to helping out with partners, to being at all the meetings, and so on and so forth. So just having a constant balance in reciprocity is important. Well, and for question one, that was a great answer. I don't really for me, like in Anishinaabe culture, when we think about why we should have philosophies integrated throughout the curriculum and history and learning, why it's important, especially for the age of students at Rosso, is because as teenagers, they're in a phase where they need to be led on clarity of their own thoughts and processes. Because when you think about teenagers, they're living a life where, you know, we talk about this in our class when we talk about different stages of life, even within the curriculum, how in Indigenous culture, we talk about the idea of Ashkenagishik, which is a teenager, and how that actually means that your mind is like swirling around, as a literal translation for a teen. So if you could interject some good knowledge of contributions from all sides into a teenager to carry forward, I think is a great age for that sponge to grow with that new knowledge. So they need to have that clarity led for them. When you're teenagers, they need to be given a little bit of wisdom and direction, even though they don't love it. No, I'm just kidding. No, even though they know it all. But I think that's the key point, because they're looking to believe in something, teenagers. So giving them all that beautiful knowledge is a great piece. Yeah.
And Corey, I'd like to add to that. We don't need to teach about Indigenous peoples, because there's too many to teach, too many cultures within our societies to teach in one place. So the focus of local Indigenous knowledge, I think, is really important. And really understanding that, because you'll learn to understand, you know, I guess at Rossa, you learn to understand from the other cultures that come here. So it is a really good process.
Okay, awesome. So, what are some best practices when supporting Indigenous focused education initiatives?
Some best practices. I think some of the best practices is being incredibly respectful of where you are, learning where you are, learning about the traditional territory of the people you're in, the treaties that apply to you here, and the history that comes with all of that. And I think you're doing some language courses here too, eh? I think learning the language is one of the things that helps you understand the culture in a way that you wouldn't get if you don't have the, you know, if you just get taught the history without some of the language and the ceremony and that kind of because the language and the ceremony teaches you the respect for land and the integration of how we are just part of the whole. We're not, you know, we're not up here over the animals. We're supposed to be a part of that whole system. And I think that kind of stuff is a best practice in understanding that whole thing. Corey, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a great answer. And those little, I find in our communities, because we are small, close-knit communities, there's similarities across the board, I find, in those simple values. So knowing where you are, respecting the community by just even using things like simple gestures in their own language is huge, goes a very long way. That's a great best practice. But even learning about the treaties, because there's so many faces of that as well, like you mentioned. So there's even unceded territory to land surrender territory to resource treaties around resources. So we try to break all that apart even within our curriculum at the school, because there seems to, like, there's a myth about treaties that they're all land surrenders. So that gives other people an idea of proprietorship over lands. So we actually look at all those definitions, and it brings a lot of respect for the communities we operate within, and learning about the communities where our students come from. So communities like Wissahickon, community like Bear Island, and what's beautiful about those communities, because often within media in different areas, they're viewed as deficits, our communities. You rarely ever hear what's great about them. So those little pieces, like focusing on the positive pieces of communities, looking at those simple things like knowing what families are in the community, the history of the community, what treaty they lie under, even what language they speak, to what the common greetings are you might hear around the community. Those little pieces all add up, especially in best practices, for sure. Yeah.
So there's a right way and a wrong way to approach any community or cause. What are some key values that are respected when working with Indigenous communities?
It's interesting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the IPRF at this point, because the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, because our philosophy at the IPRF is there is brilliance and ingenuity in our communities. And often we're talked about, as Corey said, we look at it as a deficit society, as deficit, and what we try and do at IPRF is look at the community and say there's brilliance and ingenuity. And how do I know that? You're here. You're the brilliance and ingenuity in our community, and you come out of that community. I come out of that community. Right. And I think those are the things we got to look at and say, if we can come out of those communities, we're not a deficit society. And so understanding that key respect and kindness is one of the, I think sometimes we need to understand that when you approach a community or you're going into an Indigenous community, look for the protocols of that community. Understand what the protocols of that community are, so that when you come into those communities, you have some sense of who they are and what they're doing. And when I happen to travel with students on ice, and when I remember thinking as I was traveling through the Inuit communities up there, how important it was for me, even though I was an Indigenous person, I was still a guest, just like my friends who weren't Indigenous in their community. So I needed to come in as a guest, not as they're Indigenous, I'm Indigenous, therefore we're the same. We're not the same. Right. So that's one of the things that I really believe is really important, is try to understand where you're going, and don't come in with the attitude that I know what I'm coming into. Mm-hmm. Come in with an attitude of, I'm going to learn from you.
Right. Yeah. So RLC boasts 25 nationalities on our campus. When considering equity, diversity, and inclusivity, how does 7 generations in Indigenous philosophy fit with our diverse community?
I can't help it but go to the medicine wheel.
Yeah.
And the medicine wheel, we talk about the four colors of people. It's one of the teachings of the medicine wheel, and that in order to be inclusive and close the circle, we need to be inclusive of all those people. And being equity, and I always think of equity and equality as two different things. Because I think when people understand equality, it's treat everybody the same. But I always say, I always say this about my boys, and I say this often. Each of my boys are incredibly different. I have three sons, and each of them are incredibly different. If I treated them equally, none of them would be getting what they need. But if I treat them with equity, they all get what they need. And sometimes there's more need in some places than the other one needs, and we just have to figure that out to get them to a place where that's fair. I think, I think one of the things is in inclusion is when you're in a room, always look to make sure that everybody's included, and if you can, if you see that somebody's not, reach out to that person and try and understand why they're not feeling part of it. I think you can, when I was younger, I remember feeling uncomfortable in places. And I've learned to say, when I'm uncomfortable, I don't necessarily think it's the room. I sometimes think it's, I'm not taking up my space in that room. And so therefore I can't say, they did this to me. If I don't take my space in that room, then that's on me, not on the room. But sometimes I think we don't have the confidence to take our space. And when we see somebody who doesn't have that confidence, maybe we help them take that space. Corey, what would you say?
No, I think that's great, especially the mention of the medicine wheel. A big part of RLC in our community is that diversity part. And when teachers speak about that, a lot of teachers use the example of the medicine wheel in different ways in their classroom, especially around the idea of wholesomeness within the individual. So like self-growth, self-development, mental health and well-being, how to grow that in a positive light. But a lot of cultures from a lot of different countries on RLC's campus can actually relate to those foundational understandings of the medicine wheel. So it's really great to see our students, when they learn about the medicine wheel, then they compare it to Buddhism or like Shintoism and like Confucianism and stuff, because they're very similar beliefs. And then talking about core beliefs of any belief, right? The original intention of it. And when we dive into those pieces, then we start looking at the original intention, whether it's religious or spiritual, and how they're all built on kindness and being mindful and caring about one another. So it always gives these big, beautiful conversations in classrooms that it sparks up. So that idea of the seven generation teachings and talking about the seven grandfather teachings, all of it kind of ties together. So it always leads to these beautiful, beautiful conversations, which is really great. And yeah, and just going back to the previous question, the right way and the wrong way to approach communities. I love that piece of talking about how our communities are so diverse. So for instance, at RLC, we have people from the Anishinaabe Nation that attend our school, but we have students from the Algonquin Nation as well. Like we have Ojibwe people, we have Algonquins, and then we also have Kanikiaga from Wata. So we have three different Indigenous cultures, and each one of them have different belief systems. And then we have some Potawatomi students too. So we actually have four different Indigenous nations. A lot of them are very similar, but there's beauty and little intricacies of differences, right? And each one of the communities has a vast different history, and each one of the communities might be under a whole different treaty. So there's all these great pieces of history that get taught as well. And then people on the outside get to learn about the intricacies of those cultural protocols between each of our communities. And again, when we go to another community, we're always a visitor. It doesn't matter if we're Indigenous or not. And I think that point is such a big point that people don't understand. So even the other day, when we did the Kindaso Da Day, we had two presenters who were Kinikiaga, they're Mohawk, and we were talking about how me being Ojibwe and they being Mohawk, the animosity between our people historically, and then all the jokes in our family about each other, right? So it's kind of neat to see, but you know, that bonding over those jokes, but also again, when you're in another nation's territory, it's about that respect that you give those protocols, that you're a guest. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that was a really great mention. But yeah, with EDI, with equity, diversity, inclusivity, I always trip on that word. It fits really, really well. And again, we bring it all around together with our understanding of how we build relationships in our society. So it fits well with a lot of different belief systems. So it's neat to see how other people pick that up and relate it. It's just so powerful when that happens. So it's very, very nice.
So, when thinking about Indigenous communities, one of the core values is reciprocity. Why is walking hand in hand important in the act of giving?
Thinking about when thinking about Indigenous communities, so reciprocity. It's interesting because the you know we have it's a reciprocity is something we grow up with, or we live with, and when we talk about taking from the land, we talk about giving back, and it's a value that we grow up with. Or it's always taking what you need and using it, but leaving always enough for those following behind you. It's that whole value system. And when I think of reciprocity and reconciliation, I think that it's really important that while you're when you talk about walking hand in hand, we have to relearn. We all have to relearn something. The history in Canada, our history in Canada, and how we got here is something that we share. And I always go back to Senator Sintar when he was the head of the the Royal Commission on Truth and Reconciliation. He talked about it isn't only Indigenous people who were taught that we were less than. The non-Indigenous people were also taught that we were less than. So we all have to learn that how to create a reciprocal relationship again, one that was intended, and from the treaties that we have and all of those things. And I think it's incredibly important for us. And I know in your school, you're learning reciprocal, you're learning about other cultures and they're learning about your culture. So there's a constant learning process happening. And I just think that's really important. And I guess I sometimes think the other word that you hear often is this resilience, the resilience of Indigenous peoples. But it is, all those things are incredibly important for us, and we need to, in education, we all need to relearn and understand what our shared history is in this country, so that we can all build a better Canada, so that you will have a better future. And I think that's really important. Corey.
Yeah, definitely. With the act of giving, I think the reciprocity is definitely key. And you touched on it earlier about having kind of the same spot at the same table. I think that's a big piece in providing space. But also with the act of giving, the good work that the philanthropic sector, I always want to say that wrong almost, but the good work that they do in our communities, there's a lot of great organizations that do so many good programmings that aren't just recreational or cultural or anything of the sort. When you think about it, all those type of programs that are supported by donors, by philanthropists, by different foundations, those programs are also prevention, right? So the act of giving within communities is huge. It can help change people's lives, and many of them do a lot of great work in communities. But I think it's always that walking hand in hand and starting the process together, and learning from each other is huge. Learning never ends, right? So, I think that's a huge piece that people have to open up to, that one, doesn't overpower the other, and that both sides approach always with an open mind for growth, to learn from each other, and great things can be done. Yeah.
So, why is supporting Indigenous focused education initiatives through philanthropy important?
It's interesting because this is my favorite thing in the world. So I became interested in philanthropy before I knew what the word philanthropy meant. And I go back to my time as a young person at Bear Island. I was really interested always in building clubs or something. And I guess if I think about it, what I liked was I would describe myself as a community builder. And I think in some ways, there is philanthropy. If you think about what that word means, it talks about love of humankind. That's what philanthropy means, literally. And I think when in the world that we're talking about, people think about, it became a place where people put money in order to do the things they might be interested in doing. But in true philanthropy, it means to do the things for love of mankind, for love of humankind. And we at the IPRF, the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, are doing things like, we see ourselves as a bridge between philanthropy as we know it and through Indigenous communities. And we're all walking over this bridge together to try and create a hand in hand. I often think, when we talk to our donors, we say, come walk with us, and we'll walk together to create a better world for us. And I think for philanthropy to be an education, it is education of all kinds. It is, I go back to the brilliance and ingenuity and community. You often hear about building capacity in community. I think the capacity is in the community. It is the system that is, it is to support that capacity, not build capacity, but come in and support that capacity. And I think in the same way as education, we want to be able to support education so that our children will do what they need to do in order to come back and build our communities in a better way, in a better place. And I think that's really important. And it's, I could go on and on with examples of some of the things that we've done since the beginning of the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. A lot of our a lot of our applications come for cultural learning from the communities and cultural support for our communities. Some of them are land-based things, land-based programs. It just brings, it really brings out the best if you are supporting in a way that they need to be supported when they're getting money for the things that they need, not for what the outside world thinks they need. And that's what's really important. So I can't tell you how important philanthropy is for me. And sometimes we talk about philanthropy is about someday working yourself out of the need for philanthropy, and that's a great ambition, but it's something that's really important. Corey, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think the biggest piece is within our communities. You know, a lot of our within our communities, a lot of our schools are chronically underfunded. So with philanthropy, you know, if they can assist in any way to fill those gaps and those little deficits to help out the schools and help out educational supports, I think that's truly important through philanthropy. A lot of our communities seek that land-based piece, and I think that's a big piece of why of what RLC does great with our great staff and our students, and that shared learning that comes from it, whether it be cultural land-based lenses or you know, looking at traditional kind of outdoor ed. But yeah, philanthropy is huge. A lot of the times the communities don't have the capacity to pursue the land base, just in terms of little simple things, even like assets, to even having trained staff, because they might not have the budget to train the staff. So philanthropy can really fill that gap in terms of education and help out with the communities and the goals and the desires of what they want and need. And I've seen that happen in a lot of big ways with a lot of great organizations. So like Right to Play being one of them is a well-known non-for-profit in communities that does good work. There's 4 Hours Youth that I think me and you know each other through. And there's a lot of great nonprofits and you know, and philanthropists doing great work, even through family foundations too, that support educational goals within communities. Inspires another pretty well-known one. And yeah, so again, just important to provide those spaces and the opportunity to pursue what needs to be done to further education, to further learn together. Yeah, so I think that's a big piece of what we do at RLC as well. And even that reciprocity piece is we're finding ways to turn it back to the communities. So because we do have the staff with the knowledge base to go back to communities and to say, you know, how can we walk hand in hand together and support you? And you know, because your students help us grow and support us in a big way. I think that's a big piece too. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions I have for you guys today. So thank you so much for answering questions for me. And
Thank you for having us. And I just got one question for you. Can I ask you one question?
sure.
RLC, what does it mean? What does the school mean to you?
Oh, RLC to me, it's like it's like almost like a second home now. Like this is my 3rd year being here. It's really like somewhere you can come back to, and it's like somewhere I'm comfortable in. It's like small community, so I feel right at home here. So yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. So I just wanted to thank everybody for coming tonight to the Fireside, and especially Victoria. Thank you so much for all that you do in support of the 7th Gen program. It's very great to see everybody. I hope everyone has a great evening. And thank you so much for attending. In Miigwech Kibajayek, Malge Bizindieg Nogum. So thank you so much for coming and for listening tonight.